can I give you a very warm welcome to this online lecture by Sharon Dirckx that's being organised by the local group of Christians in Science here in Bristol. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew Helstrap, and I'm the coordinator of the group for CIS here in Bristol. Now, this is the first time we've attempted to do an online lecture, so we're keeping our fingers crossed it will all work well. But I want especially to thank Steph Bevan, the development officer of CIS, who's working in the background to ensure everything's working okay. So hopefully it is. Before I introduce Sharon to you, there's just a few notices that I'd like to give. And first, I'd like to say a little more about Christians in Science, the organisation, for those of you who are not aware of the work we do. We're a network of those interested in the interaction between science and Christianity. And we have a whole wide range of members, research scientists in universities, commercial and government laboratories, those in high-tech companies, engineers, theologians, philosophers, as well as students, school teachers, and administrators. But we're open to anybody who is interested in science and faith issues. We provide many resources to help individuals and churches address science and faith issues, which you can find on our website, which is certainly well worth a visit. We also have local groups around the country, and this one in Bristol is an example, but you can find out where the others are by looking on the website. Details of all the websites can be found there, but if you're interested in linking with the Bristol group, then you can get in touch with me, and I've got the details there on the screen for you. You can contact me by email. Now, in Bristol, as well as our lecture series, we run a discussion group on science and faith issues. And more recently, we've introduced a small group to support and encourage Christians who are actively involved in the scientific workplace. And we're particularly interested in welcoming those who are at the start of their scientific career. Again, for more information, do just contact me on that same email address. And if you can't find the email address, just go onto the CIS website and go under local groups, and you'll find it there. Let me tell you about our next lecture for the local group here in Bristol. It's part of our Science, Faith and Society series, and it will be given by Dr. David Randall from the Christian Medical Fellowship. It's going to be on the 25th of March, and hopefully, COVID permitting, it'll be at Christchurch, Clifton at 7:30. And he'll be speaking on end-of-life dilemmas, and I'm sure it'll be a really excellent talk. So I hope you can come to that. And then finally, before I introduce our speaker for tonight, I have a rather embarrassing notice to make, that we run our lectures without any external funding. And so we rely on people like yourself to keep us solvent. So if you do feel able to make a small donation, perhaps £3 to cover the cost of our lecture series, we'd be extremely grateful. For those of you who are on the CIS mailing list, then you will get the Bristol mailing list, then you will have already received details of our bank account, so you can make a small transfer. And if you're not on our mailing list, if you send me an email at the email address I've just given you, again, I can give you those details. And now for tonight's lecture, and this is by Sharon Dirckx, entitled On Being Human, Am I Just My Brain? Before I introduce Sharon, let me just briefly explain how things are going to run. Sharon will speak for 45 or 50 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. And to ask a question, you can just type it into the chat box, and I'll be able to see that and then select suitable questions to ask Sharon at the end. And you can put the questions in as you go along during the lecture, or we'll have time at the end for you to add them then. So at this point, let me welcome Sharon. Sharon, it's great that you're able to join us. Thank you very much indeed for sparing the time. Let me say a few words about Sharon, which I hope won't embarrass her too much. Sharon's a speaker and author at OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. She has a scientific background, and in fact, she studied biochemistry at Bristol and tells me that I lectured to her, which was quite a long time ago, and I can't say I remember it, but obviously she had a very good scientific education. She then went on to Cambridge to do a PhD in brain imaging before holding postdoctoral positions in both the UK and the USA. Sharon speaks and lectures across the UK and beyond on science and theology, mind and soul, and the problem of evil. She's also appeared on several BBC programmes, including Songs of Praise, Radio 2's Good Morning Sunday, and Radio 4's Beyond Belief. She's also the author of the award-winning book on suffering entitled Why? Looking at God, Evil, and Personal Suffering. And her latest book, Am I Just My Brain?, examines questions on human identity from the perspectives of neuroscience, philosophy, and theology. So we have an excellent speaker tonight, and we're very much looking forward to what you've got to say to us, Sharon. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for taking time on a Friday evening to hear what somebody might say, how someone might answer a question like, am I just my brain? So let me just bring the slides up, and I'm assuming that can be seen. And so let me just check. Is that visible before I set out? Yes, I will assume it is. Okay. Well, an early childhood memory of mine is of sitting by a window on a rainy day, watching the drops splash against the pane, and most of the time I spent my life racing around like all normal children. But at this moment, I found myself quite still and suddenly having kind of time to think, and a series of questions popped into my head at that point. The questions were this: why can I think? Why do I exist? Why am I a living, breathing, conscious being who experiences life? And I don't really know where the questions came from. I wasn't raised to think big questions necessarily. I was raised in a religiously neutral home, although a very loving one. Those questions were just there, seemingly unprompted. And perhaps when many of us sit still for long enough, all kinds of questions bubble to the surface of our consciousness. And it seems to be that conscious awareness is central to what it means to be a human being. But what is a human being? Well, there are many different ways that we could answer that question. And the question of tonight's talk, Am I Just My Brain?, is asking a question of identity. What exactly are we as people? Are we advanced apes? Are we machines? Are we souls temporarily housed in a body that one day will float off? Or are we just physical, or is there more to it than this? And this is not a new question. It can sometimes seem like the frontiers of science have forced this question into the foreground once again, but this is a question that people have been asking for centuries, for many centuries. Today, if I were to ask you, the listener, what it is that makes you, you, I might receive a range of different answers. Some people might say, the thing that makes me, me is my relationships and community and family. Other people might say, well, the thing that really makes me, me is my experiences and the things that I have learned, good and bad, in life. Others might say, well, the thing that makes me, me is my career or purpose, influence in the world. And others, and the line of thought that I want to look at this evening is the view that out there by some, that the thing that makes me, me, or you, you, is our brain. It is the matter that sits between our ears. Now, clearly, the brain plays a very important role in human beings, and that is not in question in this talk. But this view that you are your brain is more strongly put than that. It says that your brain defines you. The choices that you make, for good or ill, the personality that you have, the behaviors that you exhibit, even the religious beliefs that you may or may not have, these are all dictated by the activity in your brain. Oh, and I should say, as I kick off here, that there is a book on this topic that I expand on the things that I talk about in this lecture. So, what is a human being? Now, I'm sure I don't need to convince an audience such as this, some of whom may even be in the field of neuroscience, of how incredible the human brain is. It is more developed in humans than in any other creature. It contains somewhere between 80 and 100 billion cells, each of which at any moment is sending thousands of impulses to thousands of cells at speeds of over 250 miles an hour. At any one moment, your brain is generating enough electricity to power an LED light, which is puts another spin on the notion of having a light bulb moment. And so we have this 1.5 kilo melting pot of chemicals, hormones, and electrical activity that uses 20% of the body's energy, despite only taking up 2% of its weight, which is why when you're revising or working hard or using your brain a lot, it's actually you're burning a lot of calories. It takes 20% of the body's energy. But this extraordinary organ has been the subject of much research, and there's been an acceleration in our understanding of it over the last few decades. And I had the privilege of spending over 10 years in the field of neuroscience after studying biochemistry undergrad. Went on to study brain imaging, and particularly functional MRI, which looks at brain function and maps it onto structure. And so we love the fact that we can study the human brain and figure out all of these fascinating processes. But does it follow that everything that it means to be a conscious human being can be entirely explained in terms of brain chemistry and electrical activity? After all, some very brilliant scientists believe this. Francis Crick, who co-discovered the DNA double helix and won the Joint Nobel Prize in 1964, later said this in another book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. He said, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. What do you think about this view? Is it true that we are simply packs of neurons? Is this the best story that can be told about human identity? And the "you are your brain" story has also filtered into popular culture and is being expressed even by non-scientists, such as the historian Yuval Harari, who is very well known, the author of 2 or more best-selling books, Sapiens, which looks at a brief history of humankind, and Homo Deus, which looks at the future of humanity. And these together have sold millions of copies worldwide. And in Homo Deus, Harari asserts this. He says, over the last few decades, biologists have reached the firm conclusion that the man or woman pressing the buttons and drinking the tea from a vending machine, that's the context of the quote, is also an algorithm. Humans are algorithms. In other words, humans are machines. Well, So what? What does it matter, really, what you happen to think or believe about human beings in terms of their kind of chemical makeup? Well, this actually has very far-reaching implications if it is true that we are simply our brains. Firstly, if we are just our brains, then are we really free and able to make meaningful decisions, or do we just do what our brains tell us? There are significant implications for human freedom. But if that is the case, then why do humans strive for autonomy and for their rights if actually it's not really us doing it, it's coming from forces beyond our control? There are also implications for moral responsibility, whether people can be held morally responsible for their actions, whether good or bad. And obviously that then has a knock-on effect on justice and what happens in judicial decisions. And so there are significant implications for human freedom. Secondly, there are implications for how we make sense of religious belief and experience. Are these things simply generated by the brain and therefore redundant and meaningless? So there are interesting questions that we can ask there, and lots of studies that have been done looking at what's happening in the brain during prayer and Buddhist meditation and so on. So that's a whole nother area. Thirdly, there are ethical implications. What is the value of a human life, and is personhood dependent on having a fully functioning brain? And if so, what do we do? What value do we assign to those whose brains are not fully developed, such as the unborn or premature babies, or those with brain damage, or those with a degenerative disease such as dementia or Alzheimer's? And finally, there are implications for what we believe will be possible with AI. If human consciousness can be entirely explained in terms of brain activity, then does that mean that one day there will be conscious androids walking the streets of Bristol and Oxford and so on? The answer that we give to that question is influenced by the answer that we give to the question, am I just my brain? Are we simply networks of neurons that can be replicated in theory, or is there more to a human being than that? And so the answer to the question, what is it that makes you you, has far-reaching implications. But is there a better story that can be told about human identity than simply chalking it all down to neurons and cell voltages? Well, many would agree that it's not enough to simply talk about the brain. We also need to consider the mind. You see, yes, we do have a brain with all of its neurons and electrical activity and synapses and chemicals, but we also have a mind with its thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories. In addition to a brain, each of us has an inner world, an inner reality. We each have a unique first-person perspective on the world that no one else has or can access in quite the same way. As Thomas Nagel, formerly of Princeton, now of New York University, put it in the 70s, there is something that it is like to be you. We are conscious beings. And of course, the question that some people are asking is, will human levels of consciousness eventually be possible in machines? We know that the intelligence of an algorithm is measured using something known as the Turing test, which was developed by Alan Turing in 1950. This algorithm, this test compares an algorithm and a human by asking them a series of questions. And if the interviewer, after examining the answers from both the algorithm and the human, can't distinguish which is the human being, then the algorithm is said to have passed the Turing test. And there are all kinds of examples of algorithms that have done that, such as I have here an example of a 2014 example from a 13-year-old Ukrainian boy called Eugene Guzman that fooled a third of its interrogators into believing it was human. But here's the thing. Just because a machine appears to be conscious, does this mean that they are conscious? A few years ago, my children attempted a conversation with Siri, one of the key ways that AI comes into our homes on a daily basis, or through Alexa and Google. The conversation went something like this. Siri, how are you? I'm fine. Thanks for asking. Siri, how are you feeling today? I'm happy to be alive. Siri, are you a person? Sorry, Sharon, I've been advised not to discuss my existential status. Siri, why are we here? I don't know, maybe the Genius Bar folks can answer that. Siri, why do you exist? I process, therefore I am. This may be perhaps an overly simplistic example, but it is to illustrate that our interactions with some forms of AI can give the impression that they have a mind of their own. It seems like you're having a conversation with someone, although, of course, some of the answers that are given suggest that there isn't the same level of consciousness there that a human being has. And actually, a key person to draw out this notion is John Searle in his famous thought experiment known as the Chinese room. And John Searle argues that the Turing test does not speak to human consciousness. And it can speak to information processing capacity very well, but not whether or not the algorithm has a self-awareness. And he asks us to imagine the following scenario. Imagine a person outside of an enclosed room passing Chinese messages to another person inside the room. Now, the person inside the room doesn't speak Chinese, he has no knowledge of the Chinese language, but has a book of Chinese symbols with which he can decode the messages coming in and send a reply back. Now, to the person outside the room, it looks like the person inside can speak Chinese, but that is not the case. All they can do is process Chinese characters. And that is what many philosophers would say on the topic of AI, just because, well, we know that AI has greatly enhanced, advanced, in the last few decades, all kinds of areas benefiting things like finance and healthcare and transportation, agriculture, education. It's been used to combat crime, to detect cancer, to dispose of bombs and dispense prescription drugs, and all kinds of other things. But it is a very different thing to begin to speak of algorithms possessing human consciousness. And whether or not we think androids could, in theory, do this flows out of our answer to the question, are we just our brains? And of course, when we think about what it really means to be human, it can't be reduced to a series of tasks, the kinds of tasks that algorithms are very good at. Efficiency isn't really what we value most as people. The things that make us human, the things that we value the most have nothing to do with tasks. They're to do with things like relationships and being loved and known and listened to and understood. And so humans most centrally have an inner world, a conscious mind that needs some explanation, which brings us back to the question that we were asking a few minutes ago. What exactly is the relationship between the mind and the brain? And this is actually the million-dollar question that lies at the heart of this whole conversation. It's known as the mind-brain problem. How do you get from brain cells to thoughts, from electrical activity to, I've had a difficult day to day? How do you get from brain chemistry to what it is like to be you? Or as Baroness Susan Greenfield put it, how does the water of boring old brain cells and sludgy stuff translate into the wine of phenomenological subjective experience? Such interesting language that Professor Greenfield uses. How do you get from water to wine? And Professor David Chalmers described human consciousness as being, he put it in terms of the easy and hard problems of consciousness. Many agnostics and atheists recognize that this is not an easy problem to solve. In fact, it is extraordinarily hard. Chalmers distinguishes between easy and hard problems. Easy problems, which are not easy, and a lifetime of research can be taken in studying them. But easy problems he describes as when we're looking at what happens in the brain when we move from one state of consciousness to another, for example, from being awake to being asleep, or from being under anesthetic to being resuscitated. Those would be considered easy problems, explaining structures and processes. But the hard problem is explaining conscious experience, explaining what something is like. And many philosophers and theologians and scientists agree that this is a very hard problem. And despite throwing the best minds at this for, even in the modern world, for many decades, there is still no consensus that has been reached. But the perspective driving the "you are your brain" view is essentially saying that mind and brain are the same thing. Mental states are brain states. Mental processes are brain processes, which is another way of saying there isn't really anything that it is like to be you. There is only brain activity. But surely this is an absurd way of thinking about human beings. Firstly, it is incoherent. The person expressing the view is saying, my first person perspective on the world is that there is no first person perspective on the world, and that defeats itself. Secondly, we seem to live as though human experience is genuine and not merely brain chemicals. We write and read biographies of people's experiences in the world. We lament over humanitarian crises and how this affects people's lives on the basis that they are not simply packs of neurons, but human beings who experience suffering and injustice. We now each have a story to tell of how COVID-19 has impacted us and our families and our neighborhoods. We seem to live as though human experience is genuine and not merely brain chemicals. And so chalking it all down to physical processes doesn't seem to be enough. Moreover, we don't even need to leave the field of neuroscience to see evidence that the mind itself is distinct and is powerful in its effect on the brain, which we wouldn't see if we are simply driven entirely by our brains. And you may be aware of a famous brain imaging study of London taxi drivers by Eleanor Maguire, published in 2006. And this is where London taxi drivers who have to memorize the layout of London, the knowledge, were entered into a brain scan study. And while they were memorizing the knowledge, their hippocampus size was being measured and tracked. And this was being compared with some controls who were bus drivers who didn't need to memorize the layout of London. Not sure why. Surely they would need to know as well. But in any case, they didn't need to memorize the layout, and their hippocampus was being measured. And what was discovered was that the hippocampus size in the taxi drivers increased significantly during the course of their training compared with the controls who weren't using their memory during over the same time period. And what this is taken to be evidence is of something known as downward causation, where the higher functions of the mind exert top-down effects on the underlying brain mechanisms. In other words, the mind has an influence down onto the physical processes in the brain. There are all kinds of ways in which this happens. We could speak so generally about the power of positive thinking that many have written about, or sports psychology, where your mental state, matches can be lost and won based on your mental state and whether you can pull things back and get into the game. Or medics could look at things like the placebo effect, another example of downward causation where the mind has a powerful effect on the brain and body. If you are given a blank drug that you believe to be genuine, it does have some therapeutic influence in your body. It doesn't completely solve the problem, but it does have some influence. And all of these things point to the fact that there must be more going on than simply neuronal activity. The mind is powerful in its effect on the brain. And what the science is clearly showing us is that mind and brain are connected. If you put someone in an MRI scanner and give them an experiment, a task that uses their mind, you see corresponding brain networks activated. Clearly, mind and brain are connected, and that is not being disputed. But just because mind and brain are connected does not necessarily mean that they are identical. Let's take this further, and let me try and show you why by just thinking about some other things. Imagine I were to ask you to describe to me the smell of coffee. And if we live in a purely material universe, all you have to go on is material descriptions. So how would you describe to me the smell of coffee physically? Well, you might offer me the chemical structure of caffeine, which is very interesting, but it doesn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. Or you might describe to me the physiology that's happening as I drink it and digest it. But that doesn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. If you want to understand what coffee smells like, you actually need to smell it. There isn't a physical description that can get you to that place. And philosophers describe these or call these qualia, or quail in the singular, qualia in the plural, and these are qualitative experiences that are impossible to describe physically. Other examples might be seeing the color red or tasting watermelon. And life is full of qualia. And the biggest qualia of all is the experience of being you. Imagine we were to do a study to find out what it is like for you to study for your next set of exams, or go through an audit at work, or have Ofsted come in. And we want to find out what it's like for you to go through that process. And we could put an EEG cap on you and capture some very interesting electrical data transmitted to your scalp from deep in the brain. We could also pop you in an MRI scanner and take some structural scans and some functional scans. And we could collect some very interesting data from your brain during this process. But would that tell us what it is like for you to go through it? Well, it wouldn't. To access that, we need to ask you. The data that we collect from the brain can't give us access to you, to what it's like to be you. And this is what people, all kinds of scientists and philosophers, atheists and agnostics included, try to say about this conversation. Brain processes and human experience are two very different things. brains don't think, people think using their brains. And so are there better ways of describing this mind-brain relationship that make more sense of human beings philosophically, clinically, and relationally? And so I'd love to just highlight some views that, some alternative ways of describing the mind-brain relationship that many agnostics and atheists also subscribe to. So one view is that the mind emerges from the brain. The brain generates the mind. And this view says that when a number of component parts come together, something new comes into being that is greater than the sum of its original building blocks. And that is why it is referred to as non-reductive physicalism, that there are physical building blocks, but the product at the end cannot be reduced to physics and chemistry. And this view is trying to make sense of observations from the clinic and from neuroscience that clearly say mind and brain are connected. But some problems with this view are, well, questions that those that hold this view have to answer are, well, how exactly does that happen? How exactly does a physical brain generate a mind when all you have to work on is physical substrates? In a sense, you still come back to the hard problem of consciousness. How do you cross the chasm with purely filled physical building blocks? Now, of course, a number of Christian theists hold this view, and in this case, the system isn't merely a closed system of physical processes. If God exists, then there is more in the system than simply the physical, and therefore there is hope for crossing the chasm. And Christians talk about humans being made in the image of God, and that playing a part in why we have rationality. And so that is another, this is a view that is held by agnostics, atheists, and theists alike. Another view is that the mind is beyond the brain. This view would say that there are two kinds of substance. The mind is a non-physical substance and the brain is a physical substance. And these two things are distinct, but they do interact. And I guess this view, whereas the previous view would say that because mind is tied to the physical brain, when the brain dies, the mind dies with it. In this view would say when the brain dies, the mind can continue to exist because it is its own independent substance. It's obviously a view that's traceable to the ancient world and has been voiced by philosophers in the Renaissance period. By René Descartes is someone that is famous for introducing this view into modern thinking and is held by a number of key philosophers and Christian theists today. And so this view would say that humans cannot simply be described in terms of physical systems. There is also a non-physical dimension. But of course, the question that dualists have to answer, and it's called substance dualism, which simply means two substances. The question that they have to answer is, how does a non-physical mind interact with a physical brain? And how do we make sense of that in view of the sciences, which clearly show these things to be very integrated and connected? And so there are questions to be addressed and faced by this view as well. A final view is the view that mind is fundamental to the universe. And this view acknowledges the shortcomings of trying to explain consciousness by purely beginning with physical building blocks. This view would say we need to start the conversation somewhere else. And they would say that, look, instead of starting with physics and chemistry and trying to build a bridge to human consciousness, why don't we start with mind and assume that that is fundamental and primary, and build a bridge back to the physical building blocks of the brain? And it's known as PanPsychism, which comes from the Greek pan meaning all and psyche meaning soul. And this view would say that there are levels of consciousness in every living thing, from the atomic scale through all kinds of living organisms, and then into animals and higher primates, and then human beings. And the more complex the system, the higher the level of consciousness. And so, in other words, this view would say there is something that it is like to be an electron. There is something that it is like to be trees, and of the animal kingdom possess levels of consciousness as well. There are a number of proponents of this view, and many are agnostics or even atheists, but recognize the shortcomings of reductive approaches. The advantage of this view is that it helps to put mind as fundamental again, and recognizes the inadequacy of reductive approaches. But the challenge of this view, well, there are a couple of challenges. One is, how do you account for the very distinct difference between animals and humans? It is quite hard to see how you can make sense of the seeming step shift between between even the most advanced primates and humans. Another problem relates to the unity of consciousness. If there's something that it's like to be a nanoparticle, then in theory, we have kind of trillions of conscious experiences all happening simultaneously. But our reality is that we have one experience of the world. And so how do we marry up this notion of the unity of consciousness with the idea that there are potentially conscious traces in all physical building blocks? But it's a very interesting view, and I think a very helpful one to us as Christians, because it puts the importance of mind back in the conversation. And I'll say a little bit more towards the end why that particularly helps us. Moving on, I think it's important not just to look at this philosophically. I think a holistic approach to the question of who we are and how we make sense of neuroscientific data has to also look at clinical data. And there are some very interesting things that we see in clinical neuroscience. And I don't have time to go into a study on people in persistent vegetative state by Adrian Owen that was published in Science in 2006, showing levels of consciousness. That I don't have time to talk about that tonight, but that's a very interesting data set. Another interesting data set that certainly gives us pause for thought is near-death experiences, people that have had to be put in a state of clinical death for the purposes of surgery, reversible clinical death, where their heart is stopped, their brain has been stopped, there's no detectable ECG or EEG, they're cooled to a very low temperature, the surgery is performed, and then they are resuscitated later. And surgeons began to hear reports from their patients that they were in fact conscious during surgery. Now, not all patients, but they began to systematically collect data, and between 7 and 10% report levels of consciousness. And some of the kinds of data sets that have come out are presenting corroborative evidence. For example, recalling a conversation in another part of the hospital that they then were able to recount to people later on, and certain observations of people that were congenitally blind in life that they couldn't have known it's just a hugely interesting data set that we obviously wouldn't necessarily place all of our weight upon, but it gives us pause for thought, especially in the light of the view that we are just our brains. If we are simply our brains, we would not see this kind of thing. And so how do we make sense of near-death experiences? There's one particular one of a neurosurgeon who had over a 20-year career in academic neurosurgery, including at Harvard, was a physicalist when he started out, would say that if you don't have a working brain, you cannot be conscious. Until in 2008, he developed a very severe bacterial meningitis and was in a coma for 7 days. In fact, he wasn't expected to recover. His entire neocortex had shut down, the parts of the brain known to be responsible for higher functioning. These were not working at all. He wasn't expected to survive. His family were told to put their affairs in order. And yet he extraordinarily went on to make a full recovery and recounts his story of being in a very clear and vivid reality for the time, the duration of his coma, such that he awoke with a very dramatic shift of view. He was no longer a physicalist. He was going about life with a very different take on the world. He even claims to have met a sister that he never knew he had, but then subsequently discovered had lived, and he was adopted, but hadn't realized that he had a sister, and was later shown photos that matched the person that he saw. Now, it's very interesting. This was Dr. Eben Alexander, if I didn't mention it earlier. This is only one person's view, but even one instance gives us pause for thought, especially when it required him to take on a view that would be very unpopular in academic neuroscience, the view that actually the human consciousness continues beyond the grave, which is what he went on to say, that the death of the body and the brain are not the end of consciousness. And so when we seek to answer questions of human identity, we need to take into account the full scope of human experience and clinical observation. What we seem to see is that human beings are highly complex, and simply trying to look at them and make sense of them through this one lens, the lens of cell voltages and neurotransmitters and chemical reactions, is offering a diminished view of a human being. There is so much more to us than that. And on the basis of a lifetime of clinical research, some professors of neurosurgery, including Michael Egnor, have drawn some very interesting conclusions. He would say that a good number of his patients are missing huge chunks of their brain but have intact minds. And he says this, that materialism, the view that matter is all that exists, is the premise of much contemporary thinking about what a human being is. And yet, evidence from the laboratory, the operating room, and clinical experience points to a less fashionable conclusion. Human beings straddle the material and immaterial realms. Now, as I draw to a close in my last few minutes, I want to turn and ask a question that relates to the question that I found myself asking as a child, seemingly from nowhere. You see, even if all of our questions about the scientific workings of the mind and its relationship to the brain are answered, and we hope that they are. We hope that there are some very elegant neurosciences of consciousness that come out in the years ahead. Even if that happens, there will still be some questions left unanswered. Questions arguably that science can't answer and was never intended to answer. Questions that appeared to me out of nowhere as a child. Why do we have a mind in the first place? Why are we conscious beings? Why can we think? And even David Chalmers made the point that there is a difference between finding a correlate and finding an explanation for the mind. And does a purely physicalist approach offer the best explanation for the mind? Well, many would argue it does not. The forces of nature, as I've tried to show in this talk, are not enough to explain the mind, and therefore we need to look to other possibilities. And if God exists, does that help us make sense of the human mind? Well, a number of philosophers and scientists would argue yes, it does, because if God exists, then mind is fundamental to the universe and preceded everything else. We know that the first sentence of the Bible says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which is also echoed in the opening words of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In other words, if God exists, we didn't start with chemical reactions, but with God, a thinking, conscious being, the one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, conscious beings in relationship. And Jesus, the word, the Greek logos is the word from which we get the word logic. Through him, all things were made. And if this is true, then we have grounds for making sense of the human mind, and there is hope for solving the hard problem of consciousness. And this view also says that humans are made in the image of God and reflect some of his qualities. And so we have a mind because God has a mind. We think because he does. We are conscious because God is a conscious, rational being that has chosen to extend that conscious, rational sense beyond himself and into humans as well. And it's also through our minds that we're able to uniquely connect and relate to God. The mind is the gateway to knowing God as well. And that's a very interesting thought. One final thing to say is that if humans are made in the image of God, what does that mean for us in terms of identity? Well, it means that there is an identity to us that runs far deeper than the activity of our brains, even far deeper than our success in our careers or with our, in our family relationships and friendships. And there is an identity that sits underneath all of those things that is unchanging, because it is not something that we generate. It is given to us by the God that made us. Each human being is sacred and created with inherent value and worth, and is created for a meaning, a life of meaning and purpose, regardless of the condition of their body and brain. And in a world where we are dealing more than ever with an aging population, even if the condition of our brain and mind degenerate, our value and worth as people does not change. In fact, the Bible says the opposite. It says, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day, and therefore we do not lose heart. And I was reminded of this in a very personal way through our own family situation. Last year, in the January lockdown, we lost my mother-in-law to vascular dementia. She'd had it for a number of years. And it was a time, losing her was a time of, remembering who she was. And it was obviously a very difficult time, not being able to visit with all of the restrictions. And we were praying and seeking God. We live in a different part of the country to my late mother-in-law, and we were praying for a minister that could take a service that would be meaningful to her. And we had also been praying that people would be able to go in to her care home. She had been in a care home for a number of years, and to reach her and others in this home. And in the process of arranging a minister for the funeral, we found someone, and we were arranging the service. And in the process of doing that, we exchanged some photos, and we got an email from this minister to say, "You're not going to believe this, but I've actually met your mother." And he described how he had gone into her care home about 2 or 3 months before the pandemic started, to take communion for a couple that used to be in his church but had moved into the care home. And he said that my mum-in-law was the only other person in the room and was looking a bit lost. And he asked her whether she wanted to join them for this communion service. And Penny said she would like to do that. And so she was able to recite parts of this service. She was able to pray the Lord's Prayer. Now, what you need to know is that at this point in her dementia, she didn't remember that she had children. She didn't remember their names. Her speech was not coherent. And yet, here she was praying, connecting with God, praying the Lord's Prayer, connecting with a service that she had known since childhood. And it was a reminder to me of these verses from Corinthians. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day, and therefore we do not lose heart. If we look at human beings, we see we are so much more than just our brains. And even if our brain and mind degenerates, there is still a person that matters to God, that is known by God, that is loved by God. And there is an inner reality that grows even when the physical declines. And for that reason, we are so much more than our brains. And that means that there is hope for us all, whatever the future holds. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sharon. I think you've given our brains some exercise, and there's lots of points that I think we could raise. There are one or two questions coming in, but I wondered if I could start with a question that relates to what you were saying at the end, which is that, is there any parallel between a computer hardware and software and the brain and mind? And I was thinking particularly in terms of, if the hardware goes wrong, the program, the essence of the program is still capable of running on another machine. It hasn't been lost. It's just the hardware's gone wrong. And you could see that with the real person, even when dementia or whatever upsets the brain, the real person is still there. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much. Can you hear me? My screen has frozen, but are you able to hear me, Andrew?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, I think that it's really helpful to us to try and think of analogies that help us make sense of these things that can seem quite abstract as we think about them. And I think people have talked about hardware and software in terms of trying to make sense of the brain and mind. Yes, and I think that, and I guess I'm not a computer scientist, so I don't know the sort of full ins and outs of these things. But I suppose the one thing that I would want to say is that you can't just sort of lift the software and put it in you can't just lift a person. So the person is kind of tied to their the physical body that they have. And I suppose that the Christian thinking on what happens beyond this life is that we are raised bodily from the dead, following on from Jesus as our forerunner. So these things are kind of inextricably bound, and together they make us who we are. It goes more into sort of Greek thinking to sort of think about, a mind can occupy, or a soul can occupy different bodies and can even kind of reincarnate into different bodies. That's going more towards the kind of some of the Greek philosophy on mind. But in general, the idea that there's a software that relates to computer hardware can be helpful in thinking about it. Some also then add the addition of the person sitting in front of the computer is also an integral part of it, and the way that you interact with the whole computer is a helpful picture as well.
Thank you. Now I've got some questions coming up on the feed. Daniel asks, could you say something about the difference between consciousness and sentience? I'm thinking of the spectrum of animal life and how that relates to the development of the brain mind.
Yes, thank you so much for the question, Daniel. I think if we even just look at animal behavior, it is clear that they possess some levels of consciousness, and they have some of higher primates have an emotional life, and for example, household pets are scared during a storm or happy to see you when you walk through the door. They clearly have some level of consciousness, in the sense that they are aware of their external environment and they are responsive to stimuli, and they can be trained by those around them and grow in their kind of skills, and they're responsive in that way. But it doesn't seem to be that they have a reflexive self-awareness that humans have. So it doesn't seem to be that, our household canines ponder the question, why am I a dog and not a cat? Or kind of crawl into their kennel at the end of the day thinking, I had a really hard day today, I had a kind of argument with the cat next door, sort of thing. Well, we don't know, because they don't have the same semantic language to tell us that, but that only highlights another fundamental difference between the animal kingdom and humans, that we have language, or we have our particularly complex form of language with which to express our level of consciousness. But there are some behavioral studies on animals that indicate that the differences. One of those is mirror recognition. If you put a human being in front of a mirror, we recognize that the reflection in the mirror is us. But if you put an animal in front of a mirror, they think that the reflection in the mirror is another animal. And scientists take this and other studies as evidence that there isn't self-consciousness in the animal kingdom, but there is awareness, external awareness of their environment, and some degree of consciousness, but not to the same extent as humans. Thank you for the question.
Now, Brian asks, could you comment on recent developments in consciousness research, such as the work of Anil Seth, author of Being You, and Mark Solms, author of The Hidden Spring? I don't know if you're aware of those, but that's Brian's question.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes, it's a very broad question. I think that I think I'll just have to speak quite broadly to it. I think there is a huge area of research. I can't speak specifically to those particular authors, but I think that there's a strong mindset that obviously we're wanting to try and explain things physically, and so most of the kind of the things that we're seeing are people offering neural correlates for this, and correlations between neuronal networks and levels of consciousness. So trying to look at the connectivity and the causal correlates of different states of consciousness with brain networks. And so I imagine that their research is looking at things like that, but I'm having to speak quite generally to the question. If there's a particular follow-up, I'd be happy to consider it. I think that the problem that we come up against in this whole area is the intersection of neuroscience with philosophy. You know, I could think of an example on the front cover of Scientific American a few years ago, looking at different brain networks involved in consciousness, and then there was a strapline: how neurons create thoughts. And now it's so interesting that we've gone from a scientific study of neural correlates to a worldview position or philosophy that neurons create thoughts. You can't actually draw that conclusion from neuroscience. You have to step into philosophy. That's a worldview position, and so this is a challenge that is coming up all the time in this area. Where have we moved from simply what scientific research can tell us into a philosophical position that we then impose on the science? And this is a challenge for us all.
Thank you. Question from Ian here. If we believe in evolution of human beings, we must think that animals also have less developed minds too. They're not just brains. And that's a question mark. So I suppose it comes back to whether that animals have minds as well as brains.
Yes, and maybe it ties in with the earlier question that they clearly have levels of consciousness. And what we see is that there is a correlation between neuronal complexity and the level of consciousness. As complexity increases, the level of consciousness increases. And you know, we see that even in kind of infants and, you know, child development and fetal development. It's clearly the case that complexity is correlated with level of consciousness, and certain animals do have a level of conscious awareness of their environment, but it's very hard to say whether they have a mind in the same way that we have our mind. But there are studies that indicate that they don't.
Here's a question from Ben, who says, how would you respond as a Christian apologist to Sam Harris, new atheist and neuroscientist?
Yes, I think that's a great question, because Sam has obviously written some very interesting things. In particular, has a very kind of strong view on free will, and would call himself a hard determinist, which I'll actually be speaking on at the Faraday Institute on Tuesday. This idea that actually we are entirely driven by our brains, and but actually the irony of it is that view again is self-defeating. Sam is asking you not to believe him, because if everything you say, think, and do is driven by forces beyond your control, then it's actually meaningless. It's not you saying it, it's your brain, and it's the forces of nature. And therefore, how is it possible to say anything of meaning according to this position? We also, it doesn't, the notion that we are driven by forces beyond our control doesn't seem to make sense of why humans strive for autonomy and for their rights. We're in a world of dog eat dog, and people are trying to get on in the world. But why would you do that if it's just forces that you have no control over? And of course, we reward and punish people on the basis that it isn't just driven by forces beyond our control, that we are actually morally responsible and therefore can receive reward for good behavior and punishment for bad. And so we don't live as though this is true. Sam Harris is very interesting. He's got this dual training of neuroscientist and philosopher, which is obviously standing him in good stead. The interesting thing is that I believe he is married to, he's married to somebody who is into more of the panpsychist view that I outlined earlier, and is actually thinking along Eastern lines in terms of how he's approaching life. And I'm intrigued as to how he marries that with a strongly physicalist position. And so he's on an interesting journey, and he's an interesting person to listen to. He has a large following and an interesting podcast, but there are some very, very big contradictions in the viewpoints that he puts out and expresses.
Thank you. I mean, vaguely related to that, do you think that there's any evidence for a genetic influence on the way we think and our tendency to be religious? I mean, now we're doing a lot more human genome sequencing. Has anybody attempted to correlate the any genomic variations with people who are more religious?
Yeah, absolutely. There have been, thank you for the question. There have been some very interesting studies on, if I just take religion. So there are some interesting twin studies where you compare people who are genetically identical and looking at the influence of that on their religious tendencies. And there have been some interesting studies conducted, and I think, long story short, there's a very, very weak genetic influence on religious belief. It's very tenuous. The bigger impact is upbringing. Your background influences the kind of religious expression that you have. And sorry. But of course, we would also say even background doesn't guarantee outcomes. Some of the biggest moves of God around the world are in countries where either a different religion has been enforced, or where there's a kind of systemic organization. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm losing vocab right now. Kind of systematic atheistic framework, and yet people have changed their religious views. Also, my own story that I, changed my views. And so even though background is the biggest driver, it still doesn't guarantee outcomes. So weaker genetic influence, background has a strong impact, but even that doesn't guarantee.
Thank you. Now, I have not got any more obvious questions coming up on the feed, so I'm wondering if I don't get any in the next few seconds, it may well be time to draw things to a close. I can't see anybody frantically typing. So, Sharon, thank you so much for stimulating our thinking. I don't think any of us will feel we fully understand the relationship between mind and brain. And if we did, we'd probably get the Nobel Prize. So,
well, that's it. I mean, we talk about things that are also in the realm of deep mystery. And I think that maybe the takeaway is that we're highly complex, and, body, mind, and of course, spirit is another layer that sits on top of all of these things as well, that as Christians we would hold to. So, yes.
But then when we think of quantum theory, with the things that appear to be almost impossible to hold together, and yet they clearly are, then maybe it's not so different.
Absolutely.
Anyway, let's call it a day. Thank you so much again. Thank you, everybody who's been listening. And do make sure you sign up to be on our local email mailing list if you haven't done already, so you'll keep informed of what we're doing in Bristol. Otherwise, it just remains for me to say thank you for listening and goodbye.